Now that we have a basic understanding of inheritance and some of the language and also how to construct a proper Punnett square, we're going to start looking at the 4 different modes of inheritance that we look at in the Year 11 course. The first of which is autosomal inheritance pattern. So before we can really dive into what an autosomal inheritance pattern looks like, we have to define 2 key traits here. The first word is autosome, and an autosome is simply a chromosome that doesn't determine sex. So in a human, this means that these chromosomes are going to determine somatic characteristics. So things like eye colour, hair colour, anything to do with the body itself and not in the determination of sex. Now in a human, we have 22 pairs of autosomes, and this leaves us with a total of 44 individual chromosomes. And these chromosomes, again, do not determine biological sex. So when we're talking about autosomal inheritance, we are talking about these 44 chromosomes in particular. The second word or term that we need to refer to is monogenic trait. Now, monogenic traits are not specific only to autosomal inheritance modes, but across all of them. So it's important that we understand that a monogenic trait is only referring to one pair of different alleles involving one particular gene. So the example that we've looked at most commonly so far has been tongue rolling and non-tongue rolling, looking at that in humans. So this is one pair of alleles, one for tongue rolling, one for non-tongue rolling, and they both involve one specific gene. So people can either be a tongue roller or a non-tongue roller in their phenotype. Our first type of autosomal inheritance is recessive autosomal inheritance. And when we talk about some of the characteristics of autosomal recessive diseases, we see the following 4 things. Number 1, we see that brothers and sisters of the sufferer may be affected, but the parents and children are normally heterozygous and thus normal. So heterozygotes of a recessive autosomal inheritance don't show the trait. Instead, in the diagram on the right, you'll see that our heterozygotes are referred to as carriers. They don't exhibit the specific trait, however, they do carry it with them. It's just masked by that dominant allele. Our second characteristic, so point 2 here now, 2 phenotypically normal parents, so just 2 regular parents who are heterozygotes. So again, parents who are heterozygous, 25% of their children will be affected. And we can see this 25% affected in our diagram here, where we have our 2 heterozygote parents, so capital A, little a for the father and for the mother, and they produce 1 normal child, homozygous dominant, 2 carrier children, heterozygotes, and 1 affected child, homozygous recessive. Something important to point out with all autosomal conditions is that both sexes are affected equally. One is not more affected than the other. Both are equal chance or equal likelihood of being affected. Now, our 4th point here, when we look at heterozygous carriers, we can detect them because they produce only half the usual amount, half the usual amount of functional enzyme compared to someone who is, say, homozygous dominant. An example of a homozygous recessive disease is PKU, or phenyl ketone urea. Okay, so PKU, a great example for you. When we're looking at a dominant inheritance pattern now, and this is, again, specific to autosomal dominant conditions, we have the following 4 characteristics. Now, I'm going to start at the bottom because it was the same as with our last condition, being autosomal recessive, in that both sexes have an equal chance of being affected. Now, some ways that we can tell if something is going to be an autosomal dominant condition is that every generation is affected. So there is at least 1 member of every generation affected. It's pretty safe for us to say that this is an autosomal dominant condition. Now, people who are unaffected, namely, if I highlight them in green on my diagram here, these 2 children, these unaffected individuals cannot transmit the trait. Okay, unaffected individuals cannot transmit the trait because they simply don't have a copy of the requisite allele. Our third point here is that homozygotes of a specific disease are usually never found. And this is because our sufferers usually marry normal partners. And this ends up with offspring being heterozygous. So the affected father in this situation is one of the more common instances that we see. So that was just a short introduction to autosomal inheritance.